Good afternoon, everyone. To start my part, what I'll do is to briefly summarize the methodology of campaign polls. Of course, all the companies do things a little differently. Nobody does it exactly the same way, but nevertheless, the similarities are large enough that it is fair enough to talk about the methodology of these campaign polls. And the core of it, which I'm going to outline here, can be summarized in consisting of three steps. First of all, you obtain respondents using all of these, some methods of quota sampling. Then you weight this initial raw sample to known targets of various population characteristics. Just to make that clear, let me take an example. Age is invariably one of those in groups. One of the cells you're weighting to is, let's say, those aged 65 or over. So what this step does is to make sure that after the weighting, your sample has the same percentage of those who are 65 and over than a target, usually ONS census type figure. You do this sort of thing for various other things. A set of demographic variables, age, sex, region, newspaper readership, things of that nature. And in almost all cases, also some political orientation, party affiliation or vote in a recent election, something of that nature. Now, and that gives you the first stage weights. And once you've got those, you can think of that first weighted sample at that point as your sample of eligible voters. Now, of course, not everyone votes, and at this point, no one knows who of them will vote, but we only want data from the voters. So that's where we move to the second step, which is one where we assign a turnout weight, which is essentially a probability that a particular respondent will actually turn out to vote, one way or another. Then you take those weights, multiply them with the weights from step one, and that gives you the final weights. And that final weighted sample is what we can think of now as a sample of voters that we have. And then the third step, you take the answers these respondents had given to the answer of a question about their intended vote in the upcoming election and weight that by those final weights, and that is the predicted result of the election. And just to fix that idea, here's a graph of a similar kind. Here the new color is red, which is just an unweighted average of the points in the vertical direction at each point. So this, for the final polls, most of the rest now will focus on the final polls, the 9 from the last week, one for each company. So here from moving left to right, we have the estimated Tory-Labour difference, initially for the raw data with no weighting at all. Then when you do the weighting for demographic characteristics, then adding weighting for the party affiliation one way or another, and finally multiplying that with the turnout probability. This is just to kind of put in your heads how this works. Of these, only the very last column is meant to be estimates. So these are not meant to be right. These are the final poll estimates that you've seen already. Although you do see that this time the different stages did not make a great deal of difference for the average estimate. Okay, so that's how it's done. When will it work? That's the next slide. So for this to deliver a good estimate of the election result, it requires certain things to go right, certain assumptions to be satisfied. And there are separate assumptions for each of these three key steps. For the first, the sampling stage, it's assumption that your weighting variables were basically sufficient, meaning that within levels or conditional on the weighting variables, within levels of the weighting variables, you have a representative sample of voting intention. So just to talk this through again, let me take that one age group of 65 and over again. This assumption for that cell is basically that those 65 and overs in your sample are similar to 65 and overs in the general population in their voting intention, that you don't have a systematically different set of people on that group than you do in the population. That's the first assumption. For the second step, the turnout probabilities, the assumption is that those are good probability estimates for actual turnout among those people. Conditional on the weighting variables and voting intention. So there's various subtleties about this step assumption, but broadly speaking, it's straightforward. So broadly speaking, simplifying a little, it's the kind of assumption that for those people for whom your predicted probability is 70%, around 70% of those people eventually end up voting. That's kind of assumption. And finally, for third step, which was where you calculate the estimate, this is the assumption that what they said to the question about who will you vote actually corresponds to who they voted for those who actually did vote. So, separate assumptions for each step. And I'll leave that there for your mind, while I talk about the next slide, which is a comparison many have already seen and has been in the publicity already, which is comparing the final polls again, the black dots, to two new estimates from the British Election Study, BES, and British Social Attitude Survey, BSA, different types of surveys in a way I'll describe. So those types of surveys from now on will be in blue on these slides. And again, the green is the truth. So the estimated Tory Labour lead from those two surveys is in the blue diamonds. Now there's a substantial amount of uncertainty in them as reflected by fairly wide confidence intervals around them, but nevertheless it's clear that they are telling a fairly different story from the consensus of the final polls. And in particular, if you focus on these point estimates here, they are very close to the actual Tory Labour difference in the election. Right. Well, what do we learn from this graph? Not clear is the answer. It's not yet clear what it tells us, because, going back to my 3 steps of methodology, this comparison changes every one of those 3. So if we compare BES and BSA to the pre-election polls, they're different in all 3. In terms of sampling, instead of quota sampling, it is probability or random sampling in those surveys. In terms of turnout probabilities, BES and BSA, because they were asked after the election, we know who voted, or at least who said they had voted, so there was no need for a turnout probability screen. And thirdly, question again was asked after the election when the respondents knew who they had voted for, and for that matter also knew what the election result had been, as opposed to asking the question before the election. So all 3 are different in this comparison, but there is a difference. The question is which one or which ones of these 3 explain the difference. So we have tried to look at that, try to narrow in, isolate individual aspects of this to have comparisons where not all 3 vary at once, and look at various other types of evidence for that. So I will go now through those 3 separately, starting from the bottom. So number 3, which is essentially the late swing question. Middle one is the turnout probability, turnout weighting question, and the first one is the representativeness of the sample issue. So starting with the last 2 first, turnout weighting and late swing, specifically late swing first. So this is the question of whether there was a genuine change between what the respondents said before the election and what they actually voted for. And now, evidence for this has to come from some part of the evidence, key part of the evidence has to come from after the election. And the main evidence we have used is from the recontact polls, which is where some of the companies, 6 of them in total, invited respondents from their pre-election polls, most cases the last ones only, to be interviewed again and asked them, among other things obviously, did you vote and who you voted for. So there is that comparison for the same individuals before and after. And that is what we have used for the key part of the late swing evidence. So this comparison that you'll see on the next slide is between, on the one hand, first of all, it refers in both cases to those among the recontact individuals who said they had voted. So that's controlled for. They are voters either way, so the turnout screen is out of the picture. They come from the polls, so it's the same kind of sampling, so that's controlled. So the only thing differs is, in one we used for those individuals the question, the answer they gave before the election, and the other, the answer they gave after the election. So that's the comparison you'll see on the next slide. But before that, what I would summarize what we see there is that there's some variation, some inconsistency. They're not all exactly the same. Some small sign of move towards the Conservatives, but again inconsistent. It's not there for everywhere. So that's what we see. So on the left is before, on the right is after. Again, Tory Labour difference. Some move toward the eventual result, some away, some remain relatively flat. Furthermore, there's bigger variation here than in the pre-election polls in the sample sizes of these recontact samples. So the variation is larger. So unweighted average of the points on the right is about 1 point something %, and weighted by sample size is about 0.6. So that's what I mean by saying the evidence is modest at best. But that is our evidence on the late swing question. Oh yes, and a methodological point that I should mention here in case somebody making comparisons for other similar published results. These were calculated using an additional component of weighting that was added, namely attrition weight, to allow for the fact that there was dropout. Not all of the pre-election respondents responded to the recontact polls. So to allow for that non-response, we introduced attrition weights, dropout weights, in the usual sense of non-response weights in this kind of estimation. So that was the late swing question. Turnout weighting, point 2 in the middle. Remember, this was the step which required the assumption that the assigned turnout probabilities that were used were actually good estimates of the real turnout probabilities for those individuals, conditional on the right kinds of variables. There's a theoretical argument about what those right kinds of variables ought to be, but what was actually used by the companies varied a little bit. Most used something based entirely on an individual question asked in the pre-election poll about how likely are you to vote. For example, on a 10-point scale from 0, definitely not, to 10, definitely yes, and in between. Some variants of how that was translated into probability. But there were other variants of how this was done in different companies. Some used other things in there as well. Now, this is an interesting part of the methodology because it's quite difficult. These probabilities are difficult to estimate because they are probabilities of voting given other things. And by definition, the most recent available evidence is always 5 years old. It comes from last election. So if you want to use evidence, that kind of data analytic evidence, that's where it had to come from, which is not easy if you want to do that. What the companies actually did, the rationale for the choices was not entirely obvious. It was done in different ways by different companies. So overall, this is clearly a vulnerable element of the methodology. It could go wrong, even badly wrong, and in a future election it might well, who knows. But nevertheless, in this particular one, it didn't seem to make much of a difference. Despite being vulnerable, it wasn't a big issue. And why do we say that? We have looked at, again, different types of evidence for this. Here, the like with like comparison is the first bullet point here. So the pre-election polls on the one hand, and then the individuals from the recontact polls who are known to have voting, their pre-election vote question, the one answer they gave before the election. So in this comparison, the sampling is held constant because it's still the polls. The question is asked before the election in both cases. The only thing differs is in that the second case, we know they are voters, so the turnout screen is not there. So that's the difference. So that's one comparison, and there is no big difference there. I'm not showing you that. You've seen part of it already in an earlier plot. Second kind of evidence we've looked at some length is honing in on those probabilities themselves, basically looking at, again, from either recontact polls or some data where you have validated vote, who actually voted, how the voting turnout depends on various things and how that relates to the probabilities that were used. That's another line of argument. And then finally, a different kind again, which is sensitivity analysis, which is where you take what was done, the turnout probabilities that the companies used, and change them in some way. Use different choices that could have been used but weren't, or that an omniscient being might have used if they had known everything, and see what happens. So the last one is one that I'll show you next, but the bottom line is that none of these show a really substantial effect, or even a moderate effect, really. So here's an example of the third kind, of the sensitivity analysis. So on the left you have the final polls, as they were, using whichever kind of turnout probability model the companies used. On the right, what we do is The rest of the weights are unchanged, but we substitute for the company's turnout probability model one of our own, the same for all of them, specifically one which is based on estimates from British election study 5 years ago, 2010, model based on condition on age and turnout the time before, 2005 at that time. So as an instance of one kind of modeling this, and there are various variants of this. So you can see on the right the variability in the final estimates changes, but the average not much. So there's various variants of this, and they all look like that roughly. Right, so that was 2 of the 3, leaving me with point 1, which was the sampling, and if it goes wrong it becomes unrepresentative sampling. And in a certain sense we're now saying that was it through process of elimination. So we've ruled out other things, so what's left is got to be the thing. So if everything else is ruled out, it's unrepresentative samples. Also, we know that a priori, on conceptual ground, that this is an area of methodology which could introduce a big error. It has the potential of very large effects. It's not as if we ruled out everything else and ended up with overseas voters as an explanation, which would have been a bit of a problem. So this is a potential culprit. But nevertheless, this kind of process, conclusion by elimination is not totally satisfactory. So the question is, what direct evidence have we looking at it, from that it's as itself? Again, I'm going to talk about 3 kinds briefly and show you some of them in more detail. Here the like with like comparison is between, on the one hand, voters in recontact polls and then those BES and BSA blue diamonds that you saw earlier. So in that, both are asked, question is asked after the elections because these are recontact polls versus the turnout screen is not necessary because these are both known voters or known self-reported voters. So the only thing that differs is the sampling in this comparison. So we looked at that, and you've in fact seen the elements of that earlier on earlier slides. Bottom line, the difference is still there. So the difference between the polls in this version and the surveys is still there. I'm going to show you some things about 2 other things. One is when we kind of do a curious thing of taking probability samples and making them worse. And then another one is instances of looking at specific other things than voting where we can see signs of unrepresentativeness. I'll start with the first one of those. This is inspired by and to replicate something that was done in '93 during the last polling election by Roger Jowl and others. And what happens in this is we take the probability samples, BES and BSA in this case, and only use those respondents there who were contacted early or who were reached early. So what happens in those surveys is that when a person is sampled, these are face-to-face interviews, the interviewers go to their home and try to interview them. They may not be at home, they indeed may refuse, in which case the interviewer, same or another one, goes back, often many, many times, to try to finally get the interview. So what we're doing here is using only those who were reached either at first or the second interview. And also taking those samples and weighting them, ignoring the design information from the probability samples that they were there, and weighting them in the same way as one would those campaign polls. And that's what happens. So the blue lines are now those. So first column is if we only use those who were reached immediately, first call. Middle column, first or second, and then the final is the ones where you use all the data, however many attempts it took. With BSA and BS. So what you can see there that there are clear differences. So looking at the first column in particular, the first call respondents, BSA, if you only use those, it would have been an 8-point Labour lead. BS, a bit closer to the final result, actually Tory lead, depending on the weighting, but nevertheless short of the actual final lead. Whereas if you eventually use all the respondents, then we get those results that we saw even earlier that are close to the final. So here, if you only use those who are immediately reached, things are different. Now, what we are not saying here is that this is how it went wrong for the polls. What I mean is that the kind of unrepresentativeness that characterizes those who are reached immediately at home for a face-to-face interview may well be a very different kind of unrepresentativeness that characterizes those who are in the polls online or phone. What we're showing here is that it's perfectly possible to have a large sample of interviewees and get data from them and get results wrong. So unrepresentativeness is a real thing. Okay. The next slides, and my last batch of evidence, has to do with looking at sort of direct evidence of unrepresentativeness. Now, not in vote, but in some other things. And I'll start with a simple thing, namely age. Now, for this one, there's a bit of a difficulty because we don't have that many measured characteristics in the data, and very many of those have been already weighted in such a way that they are by definition correct in the weighted sample. So we have to look at things that haven't yet been weighted to be right. So, and the one thing I look at next is the age distribution among the oldest group, so the 65s and over. So this takes a bit of explanation, this slide. So what we have here is ages from 65 onwards, and percentage of each single age, 65, 66, 67, in different types of samples. The green line is census figures, so let's take that as the truth. So you can see it goes down like that. The blue lines are the estimates for this characteristic from the BES and BSA samples. They wobble around quite a lot, because these are small groups by now, towards the end in particular, but you can see they broadly match the green line. The black ones are from the polls. There are only 3 of them, because only the three of the micro data sets for the final polls included age in years rather than grouped years. But I think I would expect, my guess would be that the story is not very different for the rest of them. And what you can see, obviously, there, that the black line compared to the green is different. And in particular, there are too many young people in this age group, so too many of the 65 to 70 somethings, and far too few of the older ones. In particular, towards the end, there are essentially no respondents from some point onwards, 85 onwards at the very latest. So we're not saying that this is exactly what explained the error, but we're saying that there are things in which the samples even are clearly not matching the reality, or the sort of population figures. Okay, what else one might look at? As I said, we don't have that many variables to look at, but others have had a little bit more and have looked at other things. So here I'm referring to some very interesting, two interesting and important recent papers, one by Douglas Rivers and Anthony Wells, and one by John Mellon and Chris Prosser, who had looked at similar sorts of questions with different data, specifically comparing BES to information coming from one way or another, one pollster, YouGov in particular. And what they had, among other things, focused on is political engagement, somehow defined, individuals' political interest engagement. And what they have concluded there is that the samples in the polls look like to have been too politically engaged, including too many people who are one way or another politically engaged. Now, what we're looking at here on the next slide is something similar. Now, for all the companies we have, using what we've got, and specifically as sort of a measure or proxy for political engagement, we're using predicted turnout. So this kind of a funny variable. It's you take the predicted probability of voting, the turnout probability, and take the average of those, the company's own predicted probabilities, which is the estimate of turnout you would make before the election. And that's what by age, and this is what that looks like here. So again, blue is the BES, BSA, and the black ones are the polls. And what you can see, there's again differences between companies, and there's more to be thought about that. But broadly speaking, you can see that most of them are too high. So at every age, the poll respondents are too interested in politics in terms of too likely to turn out. There are some differences in the gradient. Some of them, the age gradient matches the truth more closely than others. Some, it's quite flat in the sense that the association with age and turnout is also not quite as in the population. But that's subject for further more work, so I'm not going to focus on that. So that's one second example of things that we can see not being quite right, so to speak. Now, last step. One thing I haven't talked about, and I'm not going to talk about except with one example, is how this translates into the error, the sort of next step in the causal chain. Because what we know is that, as the media has discussed today, what we have concluded that the samples had too many Labour voters. Okay, well, you, as Patrick said earlier in the day, you hardly need an inquiry to figure that one out, in a sense, although it had to rule out these other explanations. But what we're getting at here is how come it came to have too many Labour voters. So if we look at these other variables, the issue there is that if you have unrepresentatives on something else, so too many people of a certain type and too few of another, that will matter if that thing itself is then, it's in turn associated with voting, if those different types of people vote differently. For example, political engagement, we do know that that is associated with voter preference. So imbalance in that can translate into an error. Now, that translation is not straightforward. It's the details of how this all happened in terms of that kind of linkage are complicated, which is academic speak for more work needs to be done by us and by others. I think this is work there. So what I'm going to do as an illustration of the kind of thing I'm talking about is to show one last thing. Again, this is not something that we're not saying this is it, this explains it. Although we also must say that it clearly must have made a contribution, but we're not saying it's the thing. Specifically, I'm again looking at age and vote, but now slicing it into a subgroup, specifically postal voters. Because this is again a group that you're going to have sort of waited for to get things right. So first picture is the ages of postal voters in the polls. Here we only have 4 polls because for only 4 of them is it known before in the pre-election poll who was a voter. But again, well, this is what we've got, and whether other polls might be different is an open question, but it may not well be that they aren't. So what we see here, first of all, blue is the British election study, and you can see a feature of the age distribution of postal voters is that they are prevalently old. So there's a large proportion of older individuals among the postal voters. That's one thing. In the polls, it's not like that. So there's clear differences. In particular, the polls have fewer old postal voters than BES suggests the population of voters actually did. And correspondingly, the polls seem to have more of the kind of middle working age, 35 to 44 aged postal voters. Okay, that's step 1. Now, let's think about link between this and vote for the postal voters. We know also from elsewhere, and that this is clear, that there's a strong age gradient between age and voting. Particularly, the older voters tend to be leaning towards conservatives more than Labour. So older, more conservative in effect. So you would imagine, seeing the blue line, that this would translate into a bigger lead for conservatives among the postal voters. And that is indeed what you see in the BES. So on the left, you've got those who were non-postal voters. It's whatever that is, about 6 points, less than 6 perhaps. Among postal voters, the point estimate is 15 and something, again with a wide confidence interval. So postal voters, perhaps partly because of their age distribution, are very heavily conservative leaning. Now the polls where we had a wrong age distribution for postal voters, we also get a wrong result for the vote of the postal voters, and in particular with one exception, partial exception here, there's a quite clear and striking result that there's really no difference in conclusions about postal voters in the polls compared to non-postal voters. Right, so this is the kind of thing that translates in an error, and once again, this is just presented here as an example of the kind of thing we're talking about, and partial evidence of instances where things clearly didn't go right. Right. My last slide is what might we do about this? Within the current paradigm, the quota sampling methodology that's used for the polls, how could this be improved? if it's the unrepresentative samples, what can be done? And logically speaking, as in principle, there are two broad ways of doing it. One is, within the weighting variables that you have, given those, you just make more of an effort to get a more representative sample. So let's suppose it was the 65 and pluses that were the problem. Let's say that group was unrepresentative now. More effort to get a wider range of 65 and overs, etc. That's one. The other one is to improve the weighting. Basically introduce more, better, stronger weighting variables so that the assumption of representativeness given the weighting variables is more easily satisfied. For example, this could be a measure of political interest introduced as an additional quota variable. Now, both of these have real difficulties in implementation of various kinds, but these are logically the options. And that's where I will stop, because this is not about the recommendations, but our report will certainly be discussing these and saying something more about them.